year 2024. Are there any members wishing to make general comments on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Quigley.
Perhaps after yesterday, it helps to put things in context, take a deep breath, remind ourselves there's more that unites us than divides us, do a little historical context, and remind ourselves our skill we're probably not as good at as we should be is empathy, right? My favorite book, To Kill a Mockingbird, the lesson is walk around in the other person's shoes for a while. So I want to try to explain how we might feel after yesterday and listen to you. I think if you put it into context, the debt ceiling deal was a tough compromise for many of us. And we're going to take heat for it, and probably more. And I'm sure some of you will as well. But, and again, I know you have a different context for this, but when the speaker said we will go through the appropriations process and we will do the numbers that we just agreed to, I know you might read that differently, but if you put it into the whole larger picture, it's tougher and people get emotional, and it's a tough enough situation as it is. But let me go back further in our context of the debt and deficit. For those of us who are here, who went through Simpson Bowles, I remember in meetings with the speaker-to-be, Mr. Ryan, who said that if we're really serious about the debt, we have to do this together. It has to be big, balanced, bipartisan, long-term, and there can be no sacred cows. This place is the home of sacred cows. And it has to include cuts and revenues. However you imagine it, if you do the numbers with how big this is, it just doesn't work unless you do all those things. Respectfully, you can pound the hell out of non-defense discretionary, and you're not going to get close to the numbers. And you'll probably do a disservice to what those agencies' missions are. You just can't come up with the numbers. So when it came over to the House, it was Cooper LaTourette, our friend Mr. Cooper and our late friend Mr. LaTourette, who took a good swing at this. Again, in the context, he got about 36 votes. We all have to ask ourselves, are we serious about that? And I respectfully tell you, you're not going to get those numbers you need just doing this. And it's probably counterproductive because of what it's going to mean. I mean, I've got talking points on THUD, and we can go through all that. But I think we need to get through this year. We know these numbers won't be agreed to in the Senate. We'll see you in conference. But I'd like to think we respect that and look long-term at what it would really take and appreciate what President Obama said the day we passed the health care law. He came to us and he said, I know that's a tough vote for you, but you got to ask yourselves, why are you here in the first place? Obviously, you disagree with that measure in some respects, but you can't disagree with what he said that morning. So let's take a deep breath, appreciate what the bigger task is, that the world is watching us for all the challenges we face. And the key to those responses is showing that we can govern in a respectful manner. That's just a little flavor of how I felt last night. I know we get angry, we say things perhaps we shouldn't in a manner that's not productive. But when I go back home, I tell folks, the appropriators I work with on the other side of the aisles are folks I like, I respect, and if we're going to come to any agreement on these complicated matters, they're as good a base as any. I still believe that, and I'd like you to think in return the same way about us. So take a deep breath, look at it from the other perspective, and let's try to be productive today. Thank you.
Mr. Cartwright is recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning. I walked in and Henry Cuellar said, "Matt, you're late." It was 10 after 8. And I said, "I'm not late." He said, "Yeah, it's 10 after 8. You were supposed to be here at 8 o'clock." And I said, "Now, wait a minute. 8 o'clock was when I said was the earliest that I will get to this meeting." Then he told me about he and his wife went to sell his house, and and he and his wife wanted $120,000 for it, and the buyer shows up and says, "Well, I'll pay $100,000 for it," and don't worry, your wife's not listening. And Henry and his wife said, "No, we want $120,000 for it," and the buyer says, "Well, no, I have $100 for it." Finally, they go back and forth, and finally they arrive at $110,000. $110,000. Okay, and they sign the deal, and away they go. And they show up at the closing, and the buyer shows up with a check for $100,000. And Henry says, "What's going on here?" And the buyer says, "Well," Henry said, "Look, the deal was $110,000," and the buyer says, "Well, no, that was a cap. That was the most that we would ever spend. I didn't say we would spend that much." Said no one ever in the history of human negotiations. So then Henry and his wife say, "Okay, then we got a deal." Said no one ever in the history of negotiations, and something that no one ever will, because that is utterly ridiculous. I hope that my brothers and sisters on the other side will reconsider that ridiculous position. I rise in opposition to the subcommittee budget allocations. In putting forth these highly inadequate allocations, the majority is reneging. It's turning its back on the budget framework it entered into as part of the agreement to lift the debt ceiling, an agreement that was approved by the House just 2 weeks ago. To enter into an agreement and then backtrack on it is not the way to get to FY24 appropriations done in a timely fashion, which I know every subcommittee chair and ranking member of this committee would like to do. Now, the proposed Commerce, Justice, and Science allocation is a cut of more than $25 billion below fiscal year 2023, about a 30% cut. I'd like to highlight a few areas where this is seriously problematic. First, cops hiring and burn justice assistance grants. Cut of this magnitude would mean the elimination of hundreds of local police officer positions all across the country. Nobody wants that. Second, federal law enforcement personnel. A 30% cut would effectively eliminate thousands of FBI agents and analysts, hardworking public servants who work to stop and prevent everything from organized crime to full-blown terrorism. It would eliminate hundreds of positions at other federal law enforcement agencies, such as the Drug Enforcement Administration, greatly damaging the DEA's efforts to fight opioid and fentanyl trafficking. Third, I'd like to invite your attention to the grant programs under the Violence Against Women Act. A 30% cut would mean fewer law enforcement officers and prosecutors to respond to domestic violence, dating violence, and sexual assault and stalking, leading to greater risk of harm to women and downgrade public safety. It would also mean that fewer survivors in rural, suburban, and urban settings would be able to receive recovery interventions. This is wrong based on policy alone, but it goes further than policy. It's about keeping your word. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I too rise in strong opposition to the proposed 302B allocations for all 12 appropriations bills in substance and against the disregard that this amendment has for the appropriations process and the integrity under which we normally operate. You know, the other day when we did the Milcon VA bill, I tried to take you back to my day and many of your day that we spent in our state legislatures. We had some adages. Being a nice Jewish girl from Long Island, now from South Florida. In Florida, when the further north you go, the further south you get. So I had a little bit to learn when I went to Tallahassee, and some of the southern adages were among those. One of the things that was often used when we were presented with essentially a ridiculous deal, or something that everyone in the room knew was not what we had agreed to. The term we used then and now was that it didn't pass the straight face test. You all know that the idea that the Fiscal Responsibility Act was a ceiling and not the starting point or the final point when it came to the allocations that we were going to be negotiating through in terms of the details of the spending, you knew that wasn't a ceiling. Traditionally, that's where we are starting. Caps are not ceilings in our world. They are the starting point. And then we negotiate from those numbers that we agreed to. That's how it has always been, and that's what we were. And do you really think that our side, that President Biden would have agreed to numbers that were a ceiling, and that he expected that when everyone left the room before, and the ink was dry, that we would come here to this room and be dealing with cutbacks to FY22 levels, which were part of the reason that they were all in the room on that negotiation to begin with? Come on, that does not pass the straight face test. Another thing that that Big Sam Mitchell in Tallahassee would have said, that dog won't hunt. Probably some of you are familiar with that expression also. This is a full-on repudiation of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, a law which your House Speaker negotiated and many of you just voted for. We obviously have very different values and very different priorities, and that's okay. We come from different districts. But not you, not me, nor anyone can sign a contract with the American people on Wednesday and 2 weeks later come back and rip it up. These allocations for our 12 subcommittees alter the purchase price of this bill on the American people after we all signed a deal and walked off the lot. In the business world, this would be a material breach of contract. Which one of you that pride yourselves prior to coming to Congress on having been really strong negotiators in the business world would get to the signing of the contract, and after the signing of the contract, when the people you've been negotiating with, after an agreed upon amount, as Mr. Cartwright just alluded to, came to you with a lower amount than you knew you were agreed to, and you said, yeah, that was just a ceiling. I mean, it's just ludicrous. First and foremost, when Democrats were in the majority, we provided the full slate of 302B allocations up front before we began markups. And I will tell you that we have to make sure that we can preserve the integrity of the appropriations process. We cannot move forward together and ensure that we can work together effectively if we are not all on the same page when we make agreements. Your word is your bond. And we have to be able to trust one another, as I said the other day. And this is a breach of that trust. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Clyde.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I could only wish that my friend Mr. Cartwright, that what he said actually was true, but it's not. You can see on Commerce, Science, Justice, the total outlay is $79.9 billion. That's not the 50-some that was mentioned. I could only wish that the weaponization of our Department of Justice was curtailed by eliminating their funding. Because that's the only thing that the Department of Justice and some of our other three-letter agencies listen to when it comes to the weaponization of this government. And we have seen it time and time and time again. That's why we have a weaponization committee to look into the issues that we've had with our government being turned against political adversaries. It's unconscionable. It's absolutely unacceptable. And honestly, I'd be happy if we cut their budget even more. Thank you. And
Ms. Lee is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me just say a couple of things about the State and Foreign Operations 302 allocations, which I strongly oppose. The State and Foreign Operations that I formerly chaired for the last 2 years. As ranking member now of this subcommittee, I want to state very clearly and unequivocally that the allocation being presented to us today for the programs of the State Department, USAID, and other related programs is wholly inadequate. It's more than $18 billion below the enacted level for these same programs, and during a time of growing challenges would leave us with resources at the level not seen since fiscal year 2009. 2009. How can we possibly stick our heads in the sand and pretend that we live in a world of 2009? We have lived through a global pandemic, and new diseases are emerging even as we deal with the ongoing scourge of like HIV and AIDS, inadequate childhood vaccination rates, women and children who continue to suffer from preventable diseases. While we are working to reassure partners around the world that the United States will be there for them as they face new challenges and rebuff aggressive actors, these cuts diminish that message and provide an opening for those that seek to undermine United States influence. And you all know that our national security strategy includes development, diplomacy, and defense. This allocation really does diminish our development and diplomacy agenda. It's a clear signal to the rest of the world that what our State Department and USAID and other non-military agencies do really, quite frankly, don't matter. After a decade of progress against hunger and poverty, we are looking at increases and setbacks. Last year, 258 million people faced acute hunger. That's an increase of 33% over the prior year. The number of people requiring emergency assistance has also increased by a quarter, forcing people to flee their countries due to conflict, drought, or increasing authoritarianism. If you're concerned about the fate of people coming to the U.S. border, the answer is in the State and Foreign Operations budget. If you're concerned about U.S. companies losing deals to competitors or loss to other countries, the answer is in State and Foreign Operations. I'm not sure if it bothers you that 244 million children don't have access to school, 25% of the world does not have access to clean water, and we still have children who die of a mosquito bite or not being able to access treatment because of where they were born. The answer is in the State and Foreign Operations budget. And I know that many of my colleagues on this side of the aisle, on your side of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle, I know the investments, that you care about those investments in the SFOPS bill, because I have seen for the last 2 years, thousands, mind you, thousands of requests from you submitted in fiscal 22 and 23, which I tried to accommodate. And yet this committee is being held hostage by a small group of Republican members that reject compromise or negotiation and reject the value of federal investments to address our global challenges. The investments made through the State and Foreign Operations bills are investments in the world's stability and the future of our children, mind you, our children and grandchildren. Americans are traveling more, trading more, and coming into contact with people from all around the world. There are no walls that are big enough or oceans wide enough to separate us from what affects our neighbors around the world. And yes, as Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the gentlelady from Florida, said, your word is your bond, I thought. To renege on a deal against the agreement that Speaker McCarthy agreed to and now backing out of really speaks volumes as to why the American public gets very cynical about our government, cynical and distrustful. And so we simply cannot address the challenges around the world which affect us here at home with a decrease of 30%, 30% in resources. This allocation, it's irresponsible, and it will force impossible choices in this year's spending. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on these very paltry and really, quite frankly, very cynical allocations. Thank you, and I yield my time.
Thank you. Mr. Sismati is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to yield my time to my colleague from Texas, Mr. Cloud.
Thank you, Mr. Sismati. I'd point out, first of all, that the 30% off were the false talking points from yesterday. Today's CJS, we were just told, was a massive cut. It's actually a 2% cut, and that's after it was increased 8% the year before that and 6% the year before that. This federal government's grown 40% in the last 2 to 3 years, and we're talking about finding targeted ways to save the American people money. I realize that some people would like to spend as much as possible. Yesterday, the comment was made that we're taking money out of communities. This committee has no power to take money out of communities. We're talking about how much we're going to give communities next year, and we're doing it in a targeted fashion. There are people who do want to take committees out of communities. There's been a lot of talk about revenue. We have more revenue coming into the government right now than we ever have had in history. We have a spending problem, and we need to have targeted, get away from the mission creep that's happened over decades. Both parties can take responsibility for it, and get back to targeted, good governance, good spending. Let's talk about CJS. Somebody brought that up, that we're making a massive cut, and maybe that's where they would make the cuts. Maybe if you were the ones making the cuts, you would make it to police grant programs. What we're talking about is we're looking at a DOJ that in the last bit has targeted parents at school board meetings. They've targeted pro-life activists. They've refused to protect SCOTUS people, SCOTUS Supreme Court justices, when their house was being protested at and threatened. They spent the last 4 years lying about Russian collusion, using this committee, the federal taxpayer dollars, to advance a lie that was started with a Clinton paid-for dossier that was fake. There's plenty of ways we can save 2% out of CJS. Let's talk about the straight face test. Last term, you were all saying that there was a Republican threat from within. You actually used that in impeachment negotiations in official congressional documents. The FBI has come and said several times that there was never any evidence to that fact. So, this is about getting back to good governance. This is about us putting the government doing what it's supposed to be doing, providing a government that works for the American people, getting rid of the woke, weaponized, and us working together to make America what it should be. Thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Capter is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I, in a way, disappointingly rise to address my colleagues in both parties. I ran for Congress for economic growth. When I ran, unemployment in my region was 19%. I've spent my life trying to repair the damage that came from oversights by prior generations. I've learned one thing: when you separate from regular order in this institution, you run into big problems. We're having big problems at a level that could threaten economic growth. I don't believe that you grow an economy by cutting federal spending. But what we can do as a Congress is give confidence to those who work every day, who invent, who imagine, and who invest, both in the private sector and in universities, in research think tanks, in the people that actually move this country forward. Where we are now is at a very dangerous stage. There is no regular order in this institution. We are not the Budget Committee. I say to my Republican colleagues, and I served on the Budget Committee for many, many years, where was your budget? Where was it? Now we're talking about 302B allocations and all the rest of this. That train already left. I don't know which of your side of the aisle or even mine is on the Budget Committee anymore, but it was the most silent mouse in the place, all right? So when you talk about the budget, where is it? We are not the Budget Committee. So we are trying to clean up, sop up the mess that didn't happen in the Budget Committee. Now, then we go to President Joe Biden, largest, right? Employment increase in modern history. People in my area are working, and they're working all over the country. And more revenue is coming in, all right? So far, so good. But did I agree with the process when one man, your speaker, our speaker, I guess, goes to the White House and negotiates with the president? There are no minutes. There are no open hearings. There's no possibility for dialogue in the open. This is really bad. We hear their side agreements. You think I know what they are? I'm supposed to come up before you and talk about energy and water. The reason we had such a bad situation when I first ran, America experienced its first Arab oil embargo. I never want to go through that again. So energy independence is critical to this country. And I have to come before you with a very flawed bill. Very few hearings. Because the whole process stalled because they were over at the White House negotiating, and the number of witnesses we had, I can count on one hand before our subcommittee. This place is not functioning by regular order. So I say to the Republicans, and I don't know a lot of you really, you better get back to regular order. So now, in the Appropriations Committee, we're talking about 302B, and we don't even know what's actually in the agreements that they talked about at the White House, and I don't know if there are side agreements that were reached that's going to affect my bottom line in our subcommittee. All right? So could I ask, you kindly raised your hand, where is the budget from the Republican Party in this House? What happened to it?
Well, the gentlelady, you.
I'd be pleased to yield to the gentleman.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate being the appointee of this great committee to the Budget Committee. It's been an education. We actually began very interested in moving a budget quickly, waiting for the president's budget as was required by statute. And we waited, and we waited, and we waited some more. A month later, his budget came out, and we got to work. We are still working. But this committee must move, as you know.
We can't move without a budget, sir.
We can move if we set our own 302B levels. The 302B levels that you have before you, you want to talk about energy and water, let's talk about the 302B level, which is a 3.25% increase over last year's, which was an increase over the year before, which was an increase over the year before. So we can talk about agreements and we can talk about budgets, but let's talk about what's supposed to happen in this committee, which is react to the hearings that we've had, and we have had several. We've had OIGs. I've been at many with you to listen to how this tax dollars of the American people are being spent, how they're being spent well, and how they're not being spent well. And let me just say, there are a lot of people in my district, a lot of people in all of our districts who feel that there are places where taxpayer funds are not being spent well.
May I reclaim my time? You kindly stood up, and this is the way we should be talking, but the point is, no matter what we approve, based on what just happened in the past 2 weeks here, the numbers are rubber. We don't really have final numbers. We don't know, and I would urge you as a budget committee to go back to your colleagues, give us a real budget so Chair Granger has numbers that are not rubber numbers.
The
because we
gentlelady's
don't know.
time is
I
expired.
thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Mr. Guest is recognized.
Madam Chairman, I just want to remind everyone of the circumstances in which we hold these discussions here today. Our debt currently stands at $32 trillion. It is projected by CBO that that debt will increase $2 trillion a year, every year for the next decade. I hear discussions from people who have served on this committee far longer than I have about how we used to do things, about how many have had the opportunity to serve with some of the peoples whose pictures hang on these walls. I know Mr. Hoyer has served in Congress for 42 plus years, elected in 1981. When he was elected to serve in this Congress, our debt had not yet reached $1 trillion. We did not reach $1 trillion in national debt until October 1981. It took this republic 200 years to accumulate $1 trillion in national debt. Now, in just over 40 years, we have increased that amount 3,200%. We now stand at a debt of $32 trillion and projected over the next decade that that will reach $50 trillion. I didn't run to Congress to add trillions of dollars to the national debt. I ran to Congress to try to rein in control the expending that we have seen. Madam Chairman, thank you for attempting to help solve this problem. Thank you for these 302B numbers. Thank you for helping Congress do what I believe that many people on the right and left want us to do, which is to bring the national debt down, which is to cut spending, which is to try to make sure that we leave this country better for our children and our grandchildren than the country that we inherited. And we cannot do that unless we find a way to get out of control spending back in check. And this is the first step. So I applaud you in these numbers, and I will be supporting this motion when it comes for a vote. And at this time, I yield back.
Frankel is recognized.
I have to give you my, so everybody say clearly about that. Listen, first, I'm going to just say something we can all agree to, which is to thank the staff for their work. And actually, all right, that wasn't that enthusiastic. Thank you, Sam. You know, I know a lot of people were a little, had hurt feelings yesterday, but I'll tell you, when I hear about other committees, truthfully, I think our debate has been pretty civilized with a difference of opinion. So I just want to thank people for being respectful. Obviously, we have different points of view on what is causing a deficit or what's causing the problems in the country. And I've heard many on the other side say, well, it is a spending problem. And I just want to offer a different perspective, because I think what's important is just to have calm, thoughtful discussions so we can really solve a problem. I mean, some of us are going to say we have a taxing problem, an unfair tax problem. And if you take a look at just even the last 25 years, folks, just between the Bush and the Trump tax cuts, that's added $10 trillion to our deficit. And those tax cuts went to the very, very wealthy and to profitable corporations. But there are other issues too, folks. I mean, we have an aging population. We have a somewhat of an inefficient healthcare system. We have had wars. We have had COVID. We have had a recession. And this is all added to the deficit. Just let me offer a different perspective. And do we really want to solve what some see as a problem by slashing child care slots so moms can't go to work? Or underfunding our food security program so children go to bed hungry so that they are not going to be able to learn? Or should we slash foreign aid so that we lose our place in the world? We spent hours talking about China in this committee room. And if we lose our place in the world, the bad actors, the countries that are bad actors are going to increase their influence. And let me just say this. Under President Joe Biden, we now have more people working than ever before in the past 50 years. And he presented a budget that would have lowered the deficit by $3 trillion without harming people. So some may call me woke. I say I'm awake. It wasn't easy, Madam Chair, to get up that early, but I say I'm awake, and I see things a little differently maybe than folks on the other side of the aisle. But I just want to say this plea, because a lot of us know each other, we've worked together, and I really hope that as we go forward, that we're going to have a spending appropriation bill that we can all be proud of and that we uplift our constituents. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Espaillat. I'm working.
Madam Chair, thank you for getting us up early. I'm a country boy from a Caribbean country. I remember when the rooster used to wake everybody up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I found this kind of late. Maybe you should do 6 o'clock next time around. But it's good because until 12 noon, I'm still optimistic. At 12:01, I don't know what happens, but before noon, I'm still optimistic and feel as though we can just do anything. And democracy, Madam Chair, is not easy. It's hard. It's very difficult. And we have a responsibility in the democratic process when we feel something is going wrong to tell our constituents that send us here what we feel is going wrong. And I stand in opposition to these cuts because they have a face. This is not some esoteric conversation that we're having. They have a first name and a last name. They have a face. And I am bewildered to understand what is it that drives government to hurt, for example, a mom that's trying to buy baby formula. Do we feel omnipotent? Do we feel, is it a macho thing that, we rather help the fat cats by giving them a massive cut and hurt a mom that's just trying to buy baby formula? How does that help our country? What does it tell the rest of the world? And so what do? We cut agriculture by 30%, a 30% reduction. So it has a name, it has a face, and our responsibility, having been, I think, reduced to where we are today, maybe compromise our constitutional duty to hold the power of the purse, is to tell our constituents what's going on here. And so commerce, justice, and science, artificial intelligence, everybody's talking about that. So what do? We cut it 28% commerce. We're losing our footing across the planet, and we whine and complain about China outflanking us. And so what do? We cut commerce 30%. Energy and water, many of you represent districts that have compromised water systems, aqueducts. So what do, Ms. Captor? We cut it 3%. The environment and interior. We saw the haze here coming from the Canadian wildfires. It smelled like a bad barbecue gone wrong. And we have our own wildfires in our country and natural disasters, and we wrestle to try to bring help to those communities. So what do for the environment? We cut it 34%. It has a name. It has a face. Labor and education. What's more important than education for the future of our nation? We cut it 29%. In New York City, they got a game called 3 Car Monte. It's a shell game. you move 3 cups around and you say, where's the red? Where's the red? And you think you know what the red is. That's what we thought when we walked here. We thought we knew where the red was, but it's a shell game. It's a shell game to confuse people and get away by perpetrating a crime. These allocations and these cuts have a face and a name, Madam Chair, and our responsibility, we can get mad in the process, but democracy is hard. Our responsibility is to tell our constituents what we're doing wrong here. I yield back and I will be voting in the negative.
Ms. McConnell will be recognized.
Chair. Where do you start? You start with the fact that I thought we should have had a clean debt ceiling bill. That wasn't going to happen. Okay, I work with my colleagues to figure out what the next step is. The next step was a negotiation between the Speaker and the President, and as was pointed out, the appropriators weren't in the room. My constituents weren't really excited about defaulting on the debt, but they weren't really excited on me signing a blank check for how much we were or were not going to spend, keeping the government functioning for them, for the things that they depend upon, that we deliver as services. So I read, like all of you, I read through everything. And I said, you know what? I don't have everything I want in here. But this is on balance. This is a compromise. And my word is my bond. And I gave it, and I went down to the floor, and people were like, oh, they got enough votes to, pass it. Maybe you don't need to do this. But I had given my word to and I had told my constituents what I was going to do. And without any reservation, I voted for the legislation, knowing that there were some big flaws in there and some things in there that I really didn't agree with and things I thought we could have done better. And I don't fault the chair. And I don't necessarily fault anyone in this room for the mess that we're in right now, because I was on the floor when it took us how many days to elect a speaker? So I know there's a lot of angst and anxiety on your side of the aisle. And I understand that. But when the 302Bs were, and Madam Chair, this is not how you wanted to come out, I'm sure. We're reading about them in the press for the first time. That's not how we have done things, both Democrats and Republicans, in this committee. And you must have been really not happy to have that in the press. And so we find ourselves here today with numbers that we're being told on our side of the aisle, now we have to live with. Numbers that many of us who voted on the floor and gave our word, gave our bond to our constituents, gave our bond to you, that we would come out of this, together as whole. And now we're dealing with cuts. And, some people want cuts, some people want to spend more money, but I'm just going to speak for myself right now. It's an honor and a privilege to serve with Ken. Ken and I have flipped roles back and forth, being ranking member and chair, and the great Republicans and Democrats I serve with on the Defense Committee. But if there's one thing I've learned, both as a student, a mother, a teacher, a Girl Scout leader, and as a member of Congress, everything's interconnected. Everything is interconnected. So if we want to have the future engineers, if we want to have the future scientists, if we want to have the future doctors, if we want to have the future entrepreneurs, we have to put the tools in their toolbox. And our national security is also dependent upon our economic security. And our economic security is dependent upon our transportation system and flying safe and being on trains and knowing that the train tracks are safe. And that's what we're here to do, is to make sure that this fabric has all the strong warp threads to keep it strong. And I'm very concerned, colleagues, that we're missing the boat on keeping some of these fabrics strong with some of the cuts that are coming. So I do have concerns. And I think those concerns are legitimate towards our national security for the workforce we need to develop, whether it's cybersecurity or the next person who's going to figure out how to do the replacement for PFAS. And that's all very important. So our passion, my passion, where I'm coming from is we need to look at this in its entirety and not keep siloing it. And that to me is one of the reasons why I wanted to be on this committee, because you get to have input on every bill and you get to understand how the government comes together. So I'll close with this. I am deeply disappointed in the numbers, but I'm deeply disappointed in some of the writers that have been put on this bill now too, that we know aren't going to go anywhere in the Senate or in the conference, but they're dividing us. So let us come together and try to make the most of what we have in front of us and stop some of the posturing that I witnessed going on. Madam Chair, I yield back, and I thank you so much for the time and the consideration.
Mr. Clymer. Clymer. Kilmer. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's okay. I'll go by anything. It's said that governing is about choices. And we make choices every time we come here. We make choices in this committee. And I rise in opposition because I disagree with the choices that we are making today. We make a choice when one day we make an agreement based on a set of numbers, and then the next week that deal gets broken. Just this morning, there was an article where one of our colleagues was quoted as saying, you can't just have an agreement and then say, we're going to change it. That colleague wasn't a Democrat. It was a House Republican, Don Bacon, who said that. I agree with him. I think he's right. A choice is made to cut funding for priorities that really matter to our constituents. And you heard many of the ranking members speak far more eloquently than I can to how those cuts affect specific priorities for our constituents in bill after bill after bill. That is a choice that we make. We make a choice to set funding levels that will go nowhere in the Senate, and frankly, that will likely have a hard time passing off of the House floor when they move in a partisan way rather than a bipartisan way. Listen, I didn't love everything that was in the debt ceiling agreement, but at the time I thought maybe, just maybe, that having an agreement on top line numbers might enable us to get a spending bill passed, maybe on time, maybe averting continuing resolutions or government shutdowns, God forbid, because we see year after year after year, we struggle most when we can't agree on what is the size of the pie, how much is going to defense, how much is going to non-defense. But in the debt ceiling agreement, we actually made that agreement. We actually got past that thing that often holds us up towards moving forward and getting a spending bill passed until we didn't. And that is a choice too. So we make a choice that puts us on a path either towards getting spending bills done on time or towards a path that makes it more likely that we will have continuing resolutions or, God forbid, another government shutdown. We make that choice. We also make a choice to be on this committee. When I joined this committee, I was told there are Democrats, Republicans, and appropriators. And I have to ask whether that's true anymore, because we make a choice whether we want this committee to be relevant, to move bills that actually have a chance of making it through the Senate, or whether we spend hours and hours in this room marking up bills that aren't going anywhere. And we make a choice to come here every week, to be away from our families and come here with the hope of delivering meaningful results for the folks that we represent. Listen, I have a district that needs government to work. There are thousands of folks who serve in the Navy, thousands of civilian defense workers who work in my district. They need this to work. I represent 12 Native American tribes that depend on us to do our jobs, to make sure that we're filling the treaty obligations that are commitments from our government to theirs. I represent communities that have faced severe economic distress. I grew up in one of them. I grew up in a logging town that used to export wood products all over the world, and now fear that their main export will be young people. And they're counting on us to deliver, whether it be workforce development programs or economic development programs. They're counting on us to make sure that there's a safety net so that if they are struggling, that we give them a hand up. And the choices that we are making will make life harder on those folks that I represent. And they sure as heck don't want us to have another government shutdown. We can't honestly believe that the choices that we are making today make a shutdown less likely. They make it more likely, and that is a choice too. And so I rise with respect to the chair and to my friends on the other side of the aisle to say we should make better choices. You know, this is a choice to do it the hard way rather than do it a bipartisan way that could actually pass the House, pass the Senate, and make this committee one that is appropriators again. And I yield back.
Thank you. Well done. Ms. Wexton is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jennifer Wexton. I represent Virginia's 10th District, for those of you who don't know me. Now, Virginia's 10th District is a Northern Virginia district. It's about an hour outside of D.C. So my predecessor in this district was a man named Frank Wolf, who I know a lot of you on this committee served with. He served on this committee for many years. He was a great man, did a lot of really wonderful things, really good things. He also did a lot on human rights, really good stuff. I emulate him in many ways. One of the things that he also did was he served with another Virginian on this committee for many years, Frank Wolf. Two of them worked together to deliver positive results for the Commonwealth of Virginia. They did not agree on everything. They did not agree on many things. They agreed on working together to produce good results for the Commonwealth and for the country. I fear that that's something that we're starting to lose. You know, they really had the belief that a rising tide would raise all boats. Now it seems like we're more interested in a zero-sum game, where somebody's benefit is somebody else's loss. And it seems like that's not the way to do things on this committee. I was so excited to join this committee because I had heard, you know, from everybody that appropriations is where the adults in the room, right? The adults in the room. And some people would say to me, you know, how could you stand being up there on the Hill? It's so partisan, it's so awful. You know, I came from the state legislature where, as Ben Klein knows, we get along pretty well. We get things done. We have the Virginia way. We have our balance our budget every year. We have to. So I understand this reluctance to have all this debt and everything. But by the same token, you know, we disagree about a lot of things as well. So coming here and dealing with this and dealing with the partisanship is very different for me. But, you know, I would say, well, but I'm on Appropriations Committee. We're the adults in the room. I really believe that. And now we see the situation where your leader has forced you into an agreement, which is these top lines, which are not what we agreed to. And it does kind of set a bad tone for everything, I think. I know a lot of you don't agree with that. I know a lot of you don't want to have that be the case, but that's what we have. So it does create a bad situation, and I think that moving forward, it'd be better if we could all just get along and hopefully, you know, get to a place where we could all work together, you know, realize that a rising tide does lift all boats, and maybe do things the Virginia way for a change. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I first of all want to thank you for chairing the committee and for your leadership. You know, early on, I was very excited about the idea of passing 12 appropriations bills, getting them across the floor, and that's our goal. We don't know if we're going to make that. That hasn't happened in a long time. I can't remember the last time that's happened. And I take to heart what the good representative from Ohio was talking about, a regular order. I think that's something all of us aspire to. But the reality is, you know, with this, you know, the debt ceiling vote, which I voted for, none of us was in the room in terms of what negotiations occurred, what agreements, what deals. And it seems like in a negotiation, sometimes people come out of meetings with different understandings of what the agreement was, right? So if I had the agreement or understanding that by agreeing to that debt ceiling vote, the Democrats on our Appropriations Committee all agreed to support the House appropriations bills, those 12 bills across the floor as part of that agreement, I could say that was the agreement. And that if they didn't vote for it, they would be breaking that agreement. To me, that's not right. I don't think anyone pledged their vote on any appropriations bill. And I think that at the end of the day, that we ought to quit impugning the integrity of people involved in those discussions. I think it's important to do what we can do on this committee, which is to work with the numbers you've given us and to try to do the best we can to get the bills across the floor, recognizing we're going to be negotiating with the Senate, we're going to be negotiating with the president, and the final product is going to be the law that we live under. But I appreciate your ambitious goal of getting those 12 bills across. I want to support that. I recognize these numbers that we have today may not be the final numbers, and no one's breaking some agreement if those numbers change through the process. But at the end of the day, we have a responsibility to our constituents to work in a civil way, in a respectful way, not impugning each other's integrity, and get our work done. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Womack.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jennifer got up to speak, and since I follow her in the roll call, I just thought it was my turn. Look, I regret that there is so much contentiousness going on in this room among appropriators, among people who can have their differences, but typically can agree to disagree and still get their work done. And that's exactly why I wanted on this committee. I will assume for the sake of the argument that when Pete beamed Jake last night at the ball game, that it had nothing to do with the arguments going on in this room about 302Bs. We need to be able to laugh. We need to be able to work hard. We need to be able to share our differences in a civil way and resolve as a group to fund the government, because that is our job. So I'm not here to debate whether or not the numbers are the right numbers. I think it's been said many times, and it is true, that what we will pass, assuming we pass 12 appropriation bills and send over the Senate, will likely look different when they come back. And I think we need to be just a little bit reserved about getting into these big brawls here on the floor in the first iteration of this activity and concentrate more maybe on getting our work done and then seeing what comes back to us so that we can then have a full-throated debate on whether or not that's going to be acceptable in funding the government. I want to say this about the budget process. And Ms. Kaptur, with all due respect, we really don't need their lectures about why we haven't done a budget. I mean, we sure did deem a lot of numbers in deeming resolutions when you guys were in control. The budget process is flawed. The budget process is broken, and it needs to be fixed. And there's a person on this side of the aisle and a person on that side of the aisle that took major votes in 2018 during a joint select committee on budget process reform that recognized, and still recognize, I think I can't speak for Mr. Kilmer, but still recognize that we're not doing our jobs as a Congress. And we need to fix that. And I hope that the outcome of this whole debate today and what may persist now for several weeks will convince everybody in here to get behind an effort to reform the 1974 Budget Act, to put us on a different glide path to getting our work done on time, because time is money, and the longer we delay the inevitable, and that's a budget resolution with 302As and sub-allocations down so that the appropriators can have the time to mark up their bills, the sooner we can get to that process, the better off we'll be. So I am hopeful that maybe a positive outcome of everything that we're doing here today will be that we will resolve as a group to fix this broken budget and flawed process for budgets that we currently are in. So I hope that we can get past the day, get our bills done at whatever levels they are. The Dems will fight for their side. We will fight for our side. Something will come out of here. We'll send it to the Senate, and then a little later we'll get it back and see what happens. I want to say this in conclusion. I worry about October 1. There is language in the debt ceiling bill that says that if we don't have 12 appropriation bills passed and signed into law by January 1st, that it will trigger a sequester, a 1% sequester off of an FY23 number. Well, our fiscal year doesn't start on January 1st. Our fiscal year will start 3 months sooner than that. And so I worry about what's going to happen on October 1st. And that's why I think it is very important that we move quickly to get our bills done, hopefully get action in the Senate, get to a conference report, be able to get our work done so the American people can recognize that the Congress is actually up here and functioning. And with that, yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Aguilar is recognized.
First, I want to thank the gentleman for his comments. I also want to congratulate my Republican colleagues for their win in the congressional baseball game last evening. I want to express to the gentleman from Texas that I meant no harm in that. If anybody feels that I know where I'm throwing, they're sadly mistaken. I don't know where it's going. Yeah, that's true. He's got a mark that says otherwise. I'm going to assume he's not soft and that it was coming with a little bit of something. Just picking up on where Mr. Womack, and first of all, I want to say to Mr. Womack, I appreciate that out of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle in the room today, he was the only one who voted for the omnibus in December to keep our government moving, to make investments in defense, to make investments. Republicans are the ones who walked away from, House Republicans are the ones who walked away from that discussion and created a 3 corners instead of a 4 corners discussion. And we picked up in January, unfortunately, in that same position by starting down a road toward contentiousness rather than coming together. And I would have wished that the ranking member and the chair would have been in those discussions at the White House. I really would have. I really would have. If there were 2 members who were at the negotiating table, I would have wished that they were appropriators. That wasn't the case. And so the one disagreement I would have with Mr. Womack is, I do want to move forward. We've got to pass these bills. But this process could have been done better. We could have passed this debt limit discussion, and then we could have marked to the agreement that we all made, or that 2/3 of the body made. That's how this process could have gone. And then we would have had debates and discussions. We would have talked about riders. We would have talked about top line numbers. We wouldn't talk about issues like dossiers, and we wouldn't talk about defunding federal law enforcement. We would talk about making investments in our communities. But now what I'm afraid of is the same thing he's afraid of. October 1, what comes? But also our posture in September. And rather than having to eat whatever the Senate sends our way, I think that's the biggest disappointment out of this discussion about 302Bs is that we're basically ceding our cards. Get your vote cards out. We're handing them to the Senate. We're giving them to the Senate to say, whatever you send over, we're probably gonna put a bipartisan number on it. But what about all the debate and discussion that should happen? So we are equal partners in that. That's what's missing. This process could have been better. We could have spent 90 days hammering out details, debating and discussing, marking up to the agreement that both sides made. And so for that, it's unfortunate that we're wasting time. And I appreciate the staff time and energy and effort that has gone into all of this on both sides of the aisle. I appreciate it. Ms. Frankel called attention to that. I just wish that that time could be spent working on a final product that can become law rather than an exercise. And so for that, there's a little bit of disappointment, but I hope that we can move forward. And I hope that it isn't 99% of what the Senate sends over that we end up having to vote on. I hope that we're equal partners in this. I'm not optimistic. And I hope that there will be a coalition on both sides of the aisle who can put the deals aside and can come together and can pass all of these bills. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. This has been a very important meeting today because we're talking through our head and our hearts. And we do have to work together. That's the only way that works. And so there's the wisdom that's been used today, I admire, and I take very, very serious. We have people that can do it better. We can work together. That's the only way we can do it. So please, please, think about this. I certainly will, and do everything I can to ensure that we make the right decisions because we work together. And that's how I feel about it. And I appreciate very much those that have spoken up, and it was difficult to do that. I know it was. But that's our game. That's what it has to be. And thank you very much. Are there any more amendments to the amendments? Any more to the nature? Mhm. Let me try this one. Okay. Hearing no other members wishing to offer an amendment in the second degree, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the chair. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of the recorded vote, raise your hand. A significant number in support. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, yes. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Siscomani, aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud, aye. Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Elzey. Mr. Elzey, aye. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, no. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, aye. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez. Ms. Granger.
Aye.
Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest, aye. Mr. Harder. Mr. Harder, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Mrs. Henson. Mrs. Henson, aye. Mr. Hoyer. Mr. Hoyer, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mr. LaTurner. Mr. LaTurner, aye. Ms. Lee of California. Ms. Lee of California. Ms. Lee of California, no. Ms. Lee of Nevada. Ms. Lee of Nevada, no. Ms. Letlow. Ms. Letlow, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mr. Rogers.
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rupersberger. Mr. Rupersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Trone. No. Mr. Trone, no. Ms. Underwood. Ms. Underwood, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Zinke. Aye. Mr. Zinke, aye.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote?
Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye.
The clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 33, the noes are 27. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. I now recognize Mr. Rogers for a motion.
Madam Chair, I move the committee approve the report on the 302B allocations as amended for fiscal year 2024.
The question is now on the motion to favorably report the subcommittee, the sublocation of allocations as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the motion is agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Aye. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. No. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amade. Mr. Amade. Mrs. Bice. Aye. Mrs. Bice, aye. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carl. Aye. Mr. Carl, aye. Mr. Carter. Yes. Mr. Carter, yes. Mr. Cartwright. No. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. No. Mr. Case, no. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Siscomani, yes. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud, yes. Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde, yes. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. No. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Elzey. Aye. Mr. Elzey, aye. Mr. Espaillat. No. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Fleischman. Aye. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, no. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Flanken, yes. Mr. Garcia? Mr. Garcia? Mr. Garcia, aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Ms. Granger?
Aye.
Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Guest? Mr. Guest, aye. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, aye. Mrs. Henson? Mrs. Henson, aye. Mr. Hoyer? Mr. Hoyer, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer, no. Mr. LaTurner? Mr. LaTurner, aye. Ms. Lee of California? Ms. Lee of California, no. Ms. Lee of Nevada? Ms. Lee of Nevada, no. Ms. Letlow? Ms. Letlow, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming? Ms. Ming? Ming? Ms. Ming? Is she? Sorry. Okay, sorry. Is she here? Ms. Ming? Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, aye. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rupersberger? Mr. Rupersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart? Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone, no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman? Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Zinke? Mr. Zinke, aye. Mr. Amadei? Oh, sorry. Okay, Mr. Amadei, yes. Mr. Stewart? Thank you. Mr. Stewart, aye. That one.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? The clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 33, the noes are 27, the motion is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that staff be permitted to make technical and conforming changes to the report just approved. Seeing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, so ordered. That concludes today's business. Yay. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Yay.
Gavel.
Oh.